Just down the brick sidewalk from here at Independence Hall, a turbulent assembly of American citizens made some of the most extraordinary political choices our country has ever known. In fact, their conversations and the compromises they made created our country. A country rooted in the belief that a diverse and growing nation could govern itself based on shared values and a shared destiny. The belief that the states of America could be united into a more perfect union. I'm George Stephanopoulos, and we're here at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia to explore that mandate. Can we create a more perfect union? Tonight we want to talk about how we can recover and refresh the common values enshrined in our Constitution, the values that brought our nation together. Do we even still share a belief in a core set of values that can help us map our future? Sometimes it sure doesn't feel like it. In our third century, facing serious challenges, both foreign and domestic, many of us are asking that question. In a time of partisan rancor, distrust, even disgust, many of us are wondering whether the idea of shared destiny and the common good can guide us through the tough decisions that challenge our still growing, still diversifying nation. Help us answer that question tonight here in Philadelphia, where it all began.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, welcome to A More Perfect Union, a dialogue on American values with George Stephanopoulos. Please welcome our distinguished guests, John DeGoya, Calvin Butts, Juliet Garcia, Michael Gerson, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, the Honorable Michael Nutter, Richard Danzig, Carly Fiorina, Luis Ubiñas, and Peter Orzog. Please give them a warm welcome. And now, ladies and gentlemen, our host, George Stephanopoulos.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to our panelists. It is great to be back here at the National Constitution Center. Tonight we're going to look at a couple of questions. What do we owe the future? If sacrifices must be made, who should pay the price? Do we Americans share common values across party lines that can help us answer these questions together? The presidents of two leading American institutions, one a university, the other a foundation, pose these questions to each other, hoping to kickstart a different kind of conversation about our values and their role in public life. And that's why we're here tonight, to begin that conversation by taking on what may be the toughest, perhaps the most important, arguably the most divisive debate in the country right now: how to secure our economic future while addressing America's urgent needs today. It's the question bedeviling Congress and the White House. It is likely to dominate the race for the White House next year, and we take it on knowing that reasonable people can and will disagree about the magnitude of the problem, how to address it, who should bear the greatest burden, and what mix of taxes, savings, and investment can actually work. But all of our panelists come here tonight in the spirit of exploration and experiment. We're asking them to step a bit outside of their professional roles, maybe even their comfort zones, to see if we can tease out some shared thinking on how to think about these problems and to figure out which shared values should guide the debate. In a minute, I'll begin by asking them to think through some of the scenarios from the perspective of various citizens, stakeholders, and decision makers. But first, let me bring in Luis Ubiñas, the president of the Ford Foundation, and John DeGioia, president of Georgetown, for some quick opening comments and to help frame the discussion. Luis?
Well, George, thanks for being here. It's wonderful of you to narrate and host us today. This conversation started actually in Jack's office, just down the road in Georgetown. And he and I were commiserating about how hard it was for us to observe the national dialogue, a national dialogue that's grown so acrimonious. And we thought about what we could do to establish a different kind of conversation, a conversation that's less blue or less red, a conversation that's more an American conversation, that asks for shared solutions, shared sacrifices, and a polite discussion about where we take this country in a time of profound crisis. And our hope is that what happens on the stage today is just the beginning of a conversation, that the audience here tonight, the audience in all the digital venues that'll see this, will continue the dialogue, and that we can spur the beginnings of an American dialogue about how to proceed from here.
I want to, George, also express our appreciation to you for this opportunity. Sure. And for Luis for this wonderful effort to demonstrate how a foundation and a university can pull together the resources that we have to show how you can blend scholarship and public interest and public policy in a new way and to frame a new kind of dialogue. We do this here in Philadelphia. And I believe at the heart of what we're working at tonight is to demonstrate the resources that we have as a people, drawing from the very values that framed us as a nation more than 2 centuries ago, American values, which are the resources that we can draw from as we try to wrestle with this very contentious debate. There's a lot at stake. What's at stake is the future of our young people, and with them, the future of our nation. And if we can draw from the values that have animated our country over the course of our history, we may be able to reframe this debate in a way that can really make a difference. Values like solidarity across generations, solidarity across different social groups. There is a great deal that's important tonight that we need to discuss, and we're looking forward to this conversation.
Well, let's get right to it then, because a lot is at stake. And we are going to try to talk about the broad budget debate that is going on in the country right now. And we don't want to get too deep into the numbers. That can cause all kinds of other fights. But I think everyone knows that if we're going to address our economic challenges, particularly our debt challenges in the future, there's a few different pots of money where you can get it. You can get it from the major universal entitlement programs that everyone is eligible for, Social Security and Medicare. You can get it from the means-tested entitlement programs, mostly go to low-income people, food stamps, Medicaid, welfare. You can get it from the rest of the domestic, what they call the domestic discretionary budget. That's all the investments we make spending on education and infrastructure, roads, bridges, and highways, food safety, scientific research. You can get it from the defense budget, of course. And you can get it from taxes, whether that's raising taxes focused on the wealthy, broad taxes for everyone, or special tax subsidies that go to corporations and other interests. So we're going to ask people to address those trade-offs in a broad way, but to do it from, as John was saying, the perspective of trying to figure out the values that underpin these debates and what we really owe each other. And I want to start out by bringing everybody to the Thanksgiving Day conversation of the Smith household. Michael Smith, played by Michael Gerson, of course, former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, now a columnist at the Washington Post. You're about 30 years old. You just started out your career, but you don't really expect to have one single career or expect any major institution or corporation to really hold your loyalty or take care of you through the course of your working life. You're a pretty self-reliant guy, but you also are environmentally conscious and highly skeptical of government across the board. Your mother is Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. But tonight, you've been, you're a bookkeeper. You've been working about 25 years. You're in your early 50s. But you lost, and you're looking forward to retirement sometime soon. But your 401k took a beating back in 2008, so you don't have much savings to rely on when you retire. And you're going to really rely on Social Security and Medicare. I want to bring in some other family members first, in a second. But first, why don't you all talk about it? And Kathleen, why don't you try to explain to Michael what your hopes are, what your fears are, what you need from government, what you expect from government.
Sure. Well, Michael, first of all, how's your job doing?
Just the way it always is. I never can get ahead.
Really?
Yeah, no, I look at my dad's generation, and they worked hard, sent me to college, but made progress over time. And now I'm looking at my own job situation, and I'm just a few years into this career, but I'm not sure I'm going to have the same rise in my standard of living. I'm not sure I'm going to have these programs exist when I get older, and so I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think you're right to be concerned. I mean, I think our country. I hope that we're having our Thanksgiving dinner in Philadelphia. It's a great place to have it because so much occurred in this city, the Constitution and the Declaration, and Benjamin Franklin, who, like you, had ideas and wanted to go forward and use them. And, you know, I really have faith that you are terrific. I didn't raise any son who wasn't going to do a good job. I really think you are terrific. And, but I understand right now, it's a tough time. I mean, the last 4 years with the economic disaster has been really tough on our country. And I hope very much that when all these arguments are going forward, that I'll get my Social Security, because, you know, if I don't have that, I'm moving in with you.
But you're relying on that, and you don't even think it's going to be there for you. So if she weren't your mom, would you be okay with her saying, I'm going to get mine first?
I pay a lot of taxes. You know, I love you so much.
You do?
but-
Tell me about the taxes you pay,
No,
sweetie.
But
No, girl,
you know, I
really.
look at how much health care you consume.
Yeah.
You're always at the doctor. And I look at, you're going to go into a Medicare system where I'm trying to take care of my kids, and I'm paying a significant portion of my income for programs that I don't think I'll ever see. Now, I understand that we need to take care of people in need in our country.
How about your mom?
Well, wait a second. I think Michael might have an ally in his Uncle Richard over here, who is also paying a lot of taxes. You run a software, you're former Secretary of the Navy, but tonight he runs a software company, 75 employees. You're doing okay. The company's hanging together, but you've seen your costs, especially for healthcare, and taxes go up significantly the last few years. Where do you come in on this conversation?
Well, first of all, Kathleen, you'd be in better position if you'd taken my advice a couple of years ago and bought Apple. But I recognize there are a lot of choices here. But just from my own perspective as a participant at this Thanksgiving dinner, I have to say that the core of what makes everything work, your Social Security, your career, Michael, is the economy. And the core of that is people out there creating jobs. Now, I'm employing 75 people in a software company. That really is the engine. And I've got to compete with people in India and a lot of other places where they're not carrying the kind of burdens I'm carrying in terms of taxes. They're not carrying the health care costs. So in the end, I'm going to, like running a race with a package on my back that weighs a large number of pounds, I'm going to be more and more handicapped and eventually lose. And when I lose, you lose.
But what do you say to your brother-in-law over here, Reverend Calvin Butts, Abyssinian Baptist Church, also the president of Old Westbury, State University of New York at Old Westbury. But tonight, you are also part of this family, Michael's father, Kathleen's husband, machinist, skilled machinist, but the company you work for packed up, went overseas. You don't have a job now, and your skills don't match the kind of jobs that you need right now. You've been out of work for 12 months. You need help right now.
Well, I mean, they ought to just bring my job back home. And we ought to stop shipping all of these jobs out of the United States of America, which can be done, and begin to produce things here in the United States of America again. And whoever came up with the idea of sending our work away should be shot. This is one of the absolute insults to the American population. We fought hard, unionized, got our jobs, got a decent standard of living. Everybody else in the world wants to come here, and yet we send what makes us great away. So I'm very angry. I'm sick of the government, but I have no choice in this country but to continue to strive and work and fight to make sure that our jobs come home. I haven't heard anybody say anything that even reflects that. My, what is he?
Let's be brother-in-law.
Brother-in-law.
My brother-in-law
My brother.
is right. I mean, we have to produce these jobs at home. I may not be able to work for him, but I can work for somebody. Somebody is doing the work that I used to do somewhere else. And my government and employers here who took it away from me ought to be held to task. That ought not be able to happen. I'm angry about it.
So all of you are feeling it at some level, talking about a value, that your opportunity to progress is being thwarted in some way. Your fear is just not going to be there.
Yeah, that the systems won't be there, but also, you know, my mortgage is upside down. Have a lot of trouble gaining wealth in this society. And it's it's a daily challenge. I'm in a professional class now, and I just don't see those opportunities even among middle-income people.
You think the government hasn't protected you by allowing these companies to ship their jobs?
Has not protected.
Has not protected you by
That's
allowing
absolutely
these.
right.
And meanwhile, you feel saddled by the government. You're just hoping that what the government has provided for you is going to be there.
Listen, I'm in Philadelphia, and I've seen our country have tougher times, much more difficult. During the Revolution, we didn't even know whether it would exist. After the Revolution, we didn't know whether we could pull together ourselves as a country. And I've seen in my long life a lot of trouble. And I've seen each time we can come back. So I think that I've raised a son who understands that it's important that his mother is taken care of. Those are the values that I've taught you, Michael.
But these women and their religion and hope, I mean, I've been married to her for all these years, and she's been talking that way, but the jobs are still going away. What are we supposed to do? Pass me the yams.
You're right, and that's when that happens, you don't give up. As I was driving here to my Thanksgiving dinner that I did cook a little bit for, but I saw some protesters, because I see that when people are down, they say, we're not going to take it. We can change what's going on. We can bring back jobs. I don't know if you just saw recently, there was an article about how more manufacturing jobs are coming here because the prices in China are going up. So don't give up.
We've got a lot, go ahead.
Another thing, if I can, that besides religion and hope here, which is the tendency to ascribe everything to government. So you said, Reverend, the government isn't stopping these jobs being taken away, or we've sent these jobs abroad. But I see very clearly from my business the way in which two things are happening. One is globalization, the other is automation. There are 2 billion more people in the work world now from countries like China and India who weren't here before. So inevitably, there are going to be all these strains. And we shouldn't idealize about the role of government and then blame it for these failures and these strains when much bigger and deeper things are causing them.
Well, can I just say about that, excuse me, but those talkable women, Germany, which is a smaller country than we are, produces and exports far more manufacturing goods than we do here in the United States. And it's because the government in Germany said, we're going to focus on manufacturing. We're going to make sure we have a trained workforce, and we're going to help small businesses manufacture and export.
We've got a lot of government representatives here. I want to bring them into the conversation right now. Since we're in Philadelphia, your mayor is going to be President of the United States tonight. Mayor Michael Nutter. You might not thank later. Listen, the Speaker of the House from San Francisco, but a Republican, Carly Fiorina, former chairman of Hewlett-Packard. But tonight you will be the Speaker of the House. You command a majority. It's enough of a majority to block what the president wants, but not necessarily enough of one to get what you want enacted into law. Juliet Garcia, the president of the University of Texas at Brownsville. You are the leader of the Senate tonight, great senator from Texas, but your majority is very tenuous. You are a Democrat, but you clearly don't have the 60 votes you need to advance your agenda, and you have a hard coalition to keep together, in part because of Luis Ubiñas, who is a Democrat, but a very maverick Democrat, never really votes the party line, often votes with Republicans, really an independent thinker who commands and can direct about 3 or 4 votes in the Senate, enough to make the difference in any major vote. Now, what I want you all to talk about is you've been brought together. You've heard everyone here address their problems. You know the country is in the midst of both an economic recession and facing a long-term budget crisis, and you have to figure out how to balance out the various needs of the country. You know the country hates all of you right now, and for a variety of reasons. So there's a real imperative to get something done. At the same time, you have a lot of different constituencies who expect you to stand by your principles. And I'm also going to bring in one more participant to all this, Peter Orszag, the former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Obama, also director of the Congressional Budget Office. But for tonight, you have the exalted position of a high-priced television economic pundit who knows more about the budget than anybody else here. And so we'll keep everybody honest as they talk about these trade-offs. And Mr. President, why don't you begin? When you look at the challenge, when you've heard what everybody has to say, how do you begin to approach it? Which values do you focus on most, and how are you going to bring this group together?
Well, I think you have to make some priority choices about what's really important. What are the core values of what is the government about? It's obviously a service provider. It also ensures our safety from not only what's going on in the country, but of course around the world. We have many, many people in pain. They are suffering. They have lost their job, possibly lost their home, their health care or pension, or know someone who has, or their hours have been cut back. So there is a lot of pain and suffering in the country right now. We have an impasse in the Congress, an inability to seemingly get anything done other than a whole lot of talk and political point scoring. In the meantime, I think that we also have to look internally. What are we doing either that we shouldn't be doing anymore? What services and programs should we just stop? How do we reduce the size of the government but still provide high-quality service? How do we engage with cities and states all around the United States of America, who are the true economic engines for this country? 80+% of the people in America live in a city, and nearly 90% of the gross domestic product comes from those cities as well. And so I think that laying out that vision, making immediate cuts in federal spending, in the government spending, look at every department and agency to see where cuts can be made, while at the same time preserving safety, making sure that there is a legitimate safety net that doesn't have huge holes in it, because we have so many who are in need in the United States of America, and then really try to pull the leaders of the Congress into a space to try to cut back to some extent. We will never fully eliminate politics in the process. I mean, I get that. But there are 18 million Americans who have no time or no interest for all the conversation that's going on among a bunch of folks who are working, have health care, and are doing pretty well
How do you
for
balance?
themselves.
How do you balance that out, Madam Speaker? You know, you heard the president talk about cutting spending. You also know that he wants to increase taxes, particularly on the wealthy, which is something that the majority of your members are against. But they're feeling the heat as well. They're on the ballot, and know that the country is dissatisfied. How do you begin that conversation with the president?
So first, since I am a Republican from San Francisco, we've clearly suspended reality.
Exactly.
So, let's continue to suspend reality, and let me say this. The Speaker of the House is the third most powerful member of government, which means that my principal responsibility is not to run for office. My principal responsibility is to govern. To govern along with the president. And
So you feel you're the leader of the
Senate.
institution more than the leader of the party once you have that job?
That is why the Speaker of the House is the third most important person in government, because that responsibility supersedes anything else. And as someone with a responsibility to govern, along with my partners in government, I think some clarity and common sense would be helpful. Given the budget deficit we face and the pain and the crisis that so many American people are experiencing, the simple truth is there are only two things we can do. We must grow the economy and we must cut spending. To grow the economy, I think we have to acknowledge that our economy is now in a competitive global economy, which means our tax rates have to be competitive. In return, in compromise, let's lower the rates and close the loopholes. To cut spending, we not only have to do, I think, what the president has just suggested, but we have to add an additional ingredient, which somehow is always missing from the conversation, and that is that we have to hold government accountable for performance. Government is the least accountable organization in the country. It is the only organization in the country whose budget can increase year after year after year after year, without any examination of the results, without any discussion about its accountability on behalf of citizens.
Well, you seem to agree on that. Everybody, that's an important value we just heard about accountability. But let me then bring in Peter to talk about something I've heard agreement on. You both say, let's go through the budget with a fine-tooth comb and get rid of every program that is not working. And I assume you're talking about the domestic.
And hold programs on a going forward basis to account. This isn't rocket science. What are the results a department should produce? Are they producing them? Example, we all agree the education system is broken. Both Republican and Democratic presidents have said the answer is to increase the Department of Education's budget. And yet, the Department of Education's budget has increased every year for 20 years, and the quality of our education in this country has deteriorated. Therefore, there is no connection, apparently, between increasing the budget of the Department of Education and improving the quality of education.
But let's say we squeeze these programs, we scrub them. What magnitude of the problem would have been addressed?
Well, let's say we leave defense to the side for a second, because that will involve a different discussion. If you're looking at domestic spending, and you're not talking about Medicare and Social Security, that's about 4% of the economy. So let's say that we could cut 20%. Wildly huge. I mean, never happened politically, but we're suspending reality. So that's 0.8% of the economy, and the deficit is about 9%. So we've cut the deficit maybe by if we're lucky, a tenth. So we've got a long way to go.
So it's something
Absolutely.
It's sort of a precondition to get anything else done. Everybody agrees we can't be wasting any money, but it's a long way from solving.
Could I ask Madam the Speaker a question though?
Sure.
Because you just logically, again, playing my TV pundit role, I just wanted to make sure we had identified all the options, because you said to cut the deficit, we have two options. We've got reduce spending and grow the economy, which of course leaves out the possibility that raising taxes could cut the deficit. So I'm just curious, when Ronald Reagan raised taxes in 1983 and thereafter, was that counterproductive?
No, in fact, I believe we have to raise revenues. The difference is that instead of raising tax rates, what I think is practical in a competitive economy is to lower rates so that they are competitive, but to close loopholes, all loopholes, and revenues would absolutely.
And that includes, when you say loopholes, does that include the broadly popular deductions like mortgage, interest, charity?
I think it's something that has to be on the table. But I think more importantly perhaps, are the corporate loopholes that exist, where lots of tax revenue is left. And the other piece to your point is, of course we have to do entitlement reform, and I think there's a huge amount of common ground on entitlement reform.
Go ahead, Mr. President.
Just one quick point. The Speaker mentioned the Department of Education and their budget. I mean, I would only point out, and I know the Speaker knows this, that the federal government is not in charge of education. That happens at the local level.
Absolutely.
And we're seeing massive cuts, unfortunately, right even here in Pennsylvania, where states are cutting education, secondary and post-secondary education systems. And so I believe in accountability. I really do. And every department and agency should have accountability measures. But in some instances, what we're seeing is federal dollars, to some extent, taking the place of state cuts or other cuts made at the local level.
Mr. President, we are in violent agreement because the wrong places are being cut and the wrong places are being increased.
Let me bring
and the
in-
federal budget deficit is growing as a
Let me
result.
bring the Senate Leader, Julia Garcia, here for a second, because what I'm hearing here is some basic agreement that we have to hold the domestic spending programs accountable, at least. We'll have some disagreements over the magnitude of the cuts that are required, but some basic agreement there. Speaker's willing to put tax reform on the table, even willing to consider finding ways to increase more revenue. That hasn't gone as far as most Democrats have called for, but the big question for a lot of you and a lot of your fellow senators will be how deeply to cut into these entitlement programs that we heard Kathleen talk about were so important to her. What would it take for you to consider, and how would you think about asking your members to go along with something like that?
Well, as long as we're suspending reality, I'm a Democratic senator from Texas tonight, so reality suspended. But I wanted to speak to one of the values that we wanted to put on the table that was put on earlier, and that's the notion of not being trusted by the American people. Because if in fact that's the case, and we all believe it to be true, that is not that we're not trustworthy, but that there is a perception that we're not speaking the truth, then the very people that we were to represent, the very people that we were meant to represent in an honorable way, if they've lost trust in us, then all the conversation is no longer meaningful. And so I think one of the things that we need to be talking about is that virtue of that shared value of we've got to bring trust back, because if that has been broken in a serious way, then there will be no strength in our position.
Does that mean
now let me speak to one of the issues on the side of education. I believe that the global environment is the one that we need to, as was mentioned earlier, we need to begin to compete in. The very people that we need to compete in that global environment are students, and the students that need to be educated. And so we need to be very, very careful about, as we've just heard, not to eat the seed corn that's going to make us productive and certainly is going to make us competitive in a global environment.
Luis, you're the independent senator, and you're the one person here who's actually been willing to try to put together a coalition that would address everything, not only everything on the table, willing to do every unpopular cut out there. You're willing to cut Social Security, you're willing to cut Medicare, you're willing to cut domestic spending, you're willing to go after defense. Actually, that can be relatively popular. You also believe there should be tax increases because you basically said that everyone has to be a part of this. But that's a very hard sell with some of your colleagues.
You know, I was listening very carefully to my colleagues, and I listen to them every day in the House and the Senate. And what astonishes me is that even today, as we're listening to this table of Americans who are really hurting, they're not connected to them. There's no mention of the fact that we just heard an American family in real pain. Some of them own businesses, and some of them are unemployed. Every one of them is feeling pain, and not one of their elected officials actually talked about that pain. And I think we've got to step back as elected officials and ask ourselves, are we really speaking for the silent majority of Americans? The silent majority of Americans who sometimes are 99%ers, but sometimes are just sitting at the dinner table trying to make their small business work, who don't want us bickering, who don't want us looking for right solutions or left solutions, blue solutions, or red solutions. They want us to find American solutions. And we in the middle, I represent the middle of us, want that bickering to end and want to be heard, that anger at the dinner table heard. Because if we don't start hearing that anger, they're going to throw all of us out.
And it's interesting.
Well, actually,
go ahead, and I want to then.
I don't know if they will.
You know what? Let me disagree with that. Because they threw us out a few years ago when your party was running it, and then they threw us out a few years before that when the other party was running it.
I must confess that I'm getting a bit confused over the role playing. Yeah. Because I actually think what we heard was a huge amount of common ground. And I think we found common ground on education. I think we found common ground, at least a portion of common ground, on tax reform. I think we heard common ground on holding government accountable as a way of beginning to restore trust. It's not just cutting a little part of the budget, it's restoring trust. The government is actually accountable for performance on behalf of citizens.
I don't like the politicians interrupting my mother. So
Well, you know politicians don't like mom interrupting them.
You're the first son I've...
I don't like paying their insurance, though. But
And I've heard
You were the first son that I've ever seen who didn't want his mother interrupted.
I've also heard some other common ground. I do hear across the board this idea that there is an independent value to government getting something done, even if it's unpopular. But let me press that a little bit, because I think that is, everybody says it, and in practice, there's a fair amount of punishment of politicians who actually then end up making those decisions that are unpopular. I mean, I guess to try to go back to the role in a second, but I want to bring Calvin in first. You expressed that real pain. You expressed that real anger over losing that job. If you saw government actually coming together and coming to some kinds of compromise, which didn't give you all the investments you wanted, did not perhaps do everything that you would expect or want to protect the job that you lost, and maybe even shaved back your wife's Social Security and Medicare a little bit, but also did make the kinds of investment in training, investment in future job creation that you would like. Is that something you could see getting your arms around, or would you be more angry about the things you didn't get?
Oh, no, I would see getting my arms around that. The reason my wife and I have been married as long as we have is because I really believe in what she has to say. There's hope, which is a fundamental American value. And when you begin to see people move in a direction that says, I might not have my job, but someone else who is out there like me is getting a job, and I see us moving and our political leadership coming together around something tangible, palpable, that's real, then yes, as an American, absolutely, because there is no better place than America. Everybody globally is trying to come here. And while I want to be a part of the global economy, I want to be a part of it representing the United States of America. And so therefore, I don't want to hear about how well China is doing or may not be doing today, or how well India is doing, or even Mexico, you know, how well they may or may not be doing. I want to hear how well we're doing, and then begin to see how we impact globalization from that point. So absolutely, that's the fundamental value of America, hope for the future.
But I'm not sure your son believes that anymore.
Yeah, he believes it. Because where else is he going to go?
My father is my hero, and he's a snappy dresser, too. But I
gotta look the part, even if you don't have
when
the
I
money.
hear these politicians say the right thing and then not do it, it actually increases my cynicism. The reality here is we've just been through a bunch of budget debates where Republicans would not address the problem because they won't do, they want entitlement reform but won't do tax increases. And Democrats don't want to do entitlement reform. And you have, a group of people that will say all the right things, and all they end up doing is cutting discretionary spending. That's all that's been done. So what can we agree on as Republicans and Democrats? We can cut education and child nutrition and AIDS treatment abroad instead of actually addressing these set of issues they all talk about.
Just what I was going to say about the government and why they don't get defeated. I mean, right now, 70% of Americans say that the rich should pay higher taxes. That's 70%. That's a high number. And is Congress going forward with that? Are they moving forward with that? No. So that's why you can get angry with it. Now, you said and you're right, I am sick, and I do go to the doctors a lot. But I would be willing to go a lot less, because I don't like to go to the doctors, if I could figure out what works. But we don't have a good process of actually figuring out what's useful. I read that over in, Contra Costa, California, they have the same problems I do, and they spend half as much, and they get better results. So I don't want to bankrupt you, Michael. I want you to have a great future. So I am willing to spend a lot less if you could tell me what works.
I don't want her to spend a lot less. I want her to get what she deserves by virtue of the fact of what she put in. Because I want her to live as long as she can. And I don't want him to have to lose anything either. And, I think one of the things that we take off the table, and I never really understand why, and I know I'm going to find out in a minute, is defense. I don't know why we have to put that in a separate category. And I think our political leadership ought to take some real nerve and go out and say, why can't we take a huge hunk of that? Because one of our great values in this land is justice And I'm not sure that all the money we're spending on, quote, defense is really doing
Well, Richard,
anything.
before you ran your software company, you were Secretary of the Navy, so you know something about this. And there does seem to be, I think you're right, I think if you look at most polls right now, a majority of the public believes that defense spending can be cut. Of course, we're still in the midst of 2 foreign wars, although one is winding down at some point. But it also appears that even though defense has been walled off, we have asked one portion of the country to fight the wars and focus most of the payment sacrifice on a very narrow portion of the population. I think it's the first time in our history we fought a war of this length without any major sharing of the payment across the population.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with my brother-in-law here about the issue of the sharing. I agree both in general with the point you're making about our value here. And I just want to make a general observation about that, which is how quickly a conversation that's supposed to be about values falls to the particulars of budgets, and not just budgets generally, but the education department and the like. I think there are 2 fundamental values right away that we share and that ought to guide us in this. One is a sense of that America is and should be a country that cares about its future, that we live not just for today, but that we want to build a better world for the time ahead. A second, I think, is that we're one society, that every one of us is connected to every other, and that when some suffer and others don't, it creates all kinds of problems for us. And then when we move to budget decisions, I think we need to understand that those budget decisions need to be made in that light. It isn't just a question of cutting what's inefficient. It's a question of reformulating in ways that are built around those values. Having said that, I think definitely defense ought to be on the table. It's a part of the issues here, and it's a large amount of money that is being spent in ways that appropriately are subject to public scrutiny and should be criticized. And is there opportunity for cutting back in that arena? My answer is yes.
So to be the cynical, grumpy TV pundit again, could I just press
Can we
on
turn
this?
you off, actually?
I'd love to, but hopefully we'll come out of these roles soon. But let me just ask. Everyone's in favor of cutting defense spending, as is sensible. But when they think of that, they typically think of cutting the DDG 1000 or the presidential helicopter. The majority of the money in the defense budget is not in R&D or procurement, where those weapon systems are. It's in people. So when we're talking about really cutting back on the defense budget, and to George's question, to really make progress on that, you have to reduce end strength, the number of troops we have. And is that something that we want to do now? Because if not, again, you can make some progress, but the money is not going to be that big.
I continue to think that there's a great deal of common ground in this conversation. But let me go back to the anger. I think one of the reasons that people are angry and concerned is because our political leaders increasingly, across the spectrum, perhaps seem too small for the big problems we have. So let's think about where we are. We're in Philadelphia, where a group of people came together and had huge ideas. And that's one of the values that we believe in America as well. Dream big, think big, try something new. This past week, forgive me, this is not a digression. This past week, Steve Jobs died. What did Steve Jobs do? Steve Jobs said, you know what? There's this thing called the music industry, and it's complicated, and it's expensive, and it's not particularly helpful to consumers. And I'm going to come up with this notion that says, you know what? We're going to have music go directly to consumers through technology. Or what did Jeff Bezos do with a Kindle? A Kindle is a device that's been around for 5 years, and Barnes & Noble and Borders are having trouble staying open. Who is it who's thinking big about how to transform and reform government to be responsive?
This has naturally, transformed the discussion to the next phase of the conversation. I think it's a good place to kind of step back, because I've heard so many, you're right, there is a fair amount of common ground. So I want everybody to step back and be who you are now, and address this question, which you're all dancing, well, you're not dancing, you're actually going at it quite directly. You have a fundamental problem now of faith in government, faith in our political institutions. I'm wondering, listening to you, whether that now has an independent value that we're not paying enough attention to, that our whole enterprise can only work if people actually believe that government is out there trying to address the problems in their lives. So I'll ask a broader question to all of you as citizens, drawing on your expertise. How do we get that?
Well, it's, I think we didn't answer your question about the military, and I would like to answer that first and then get to the question of government. I think one of the issues with the military, and my son Michael served in the military, and he described how he was very upset that so many of his fellow soldiers were killed for oil. And why aren't we making sure that we do a better job here at home so his people don't go to war over oil? And that's what happened. So I'm very upset about how we go to war and why we go to war, and I think there are times it's worthwhile and there are times that not. And I think we have to, as a country, we weren't told the truth about the war, and we had many people who are harmed and hurt because of that.
But if I may,
now,
We need to focus on that word truth. I want to,
okay, so let's now
go back around, I want to talk about
if
that.
I may, regardless of how one feels about the war, however we all feel, I actually think this is very illustrative, what just happened. Because I think what continues to happen, and the political pundits help drive this, every time people get close to saying, you know, we actually do need fundamental transformation, people who are willing to govern and put aside for the time being the probability of getting reelected across the political spectrum, that we need to talk in terms of big ideas and big reforms. Every time we get close, and I think the American people are saying, come on, we're Americans, we can do this. Every time it gets close, we get distracted. We get distracted by, oh, it's only a little amount of money. We get distracted by, why were we in Iraq in the first place? We get distracted by, let's have a tax for millionaires and billionaires, which is also a tiny little portion of the problem. When in fact, I think we're now sitting in a place in the 21st century where we have to have big ideas about growing the economy, big ideas about reforming government, big ideas about governing.
But you can only get that if you address the kind of problem. I want to bring in some other.
Let me speak. May I speak to the issue of faith? Because in truth, and I think that's kind of what started this part of the discussion. When I was a baby university president, I didn't know what that meant. Somebody appoints you to a job and you're anointed, but you have no clue what that means. So I went to several presidents to try and find out what they thought their job was about. And one I particularly went to, I said, what is the most important part of your job? And he said, preserving the democracy of the United States. And I closed my little notebook and I put my pen down and I said, please explain that to me. And he said, because if I take, this was the president at the time of Miami-Dade Community College, he said, if I take the next wave of immigrant, this year it might be Cuban, another year it might be Haitian, another year it's a native Floridian. If I take that next wave of immigrant and I vest them by educating them in our democracy, then they become the ones that will nurture it, defend it, and finally sustain it. But the whole notion there was they've got to believe that there's something for them to nurture, defend, and then sustain. And I think that the issue that grounds us all in this discussion is, are we representing the faith and the truth in the folks that we represent? And I don't think we've grappled with that just yet.
I've heard truth mentioned in the last minute twice. I want to talk a little bit about that. Because, of course, we all know the reason that no one ever talks about cutting defense spending is because you know that there's going to be an ad very shortly after that saying that you're weak on defense. That's what's going to happen. That there is so much focus and attention on election, re-election, that elected officials are worried that the public can't really deal with the truth. The public wants to hear the truth that they want to hear. And then you get forced into a box of just talking about things that you think people want to hear. If you do the job in a way that says, I'm going to do this because I actually believe that this is the best thing for my city, my state, or my country, notwithstanding whatever's going to happen to me, because you can probably find another job. If people were less focused on re-election and more focused on results and just doing the job, we'd actually get a lot more done.
Absolutely. And George, I would just say
Absolutely.
this. Your question asked, why is it that Americans don't have more faith in government? I think the more appropriate question is, why is it that our leaders aren't earning the trust and faith and confidence of Americans? It is very easy to understand why it is Americans don't have faith in government. We're in the worst crisis this country's seen since the Great Depression. We're in 2 wars. The civil discourse is dysfunctional. It would be irrational for an American to have faith in government under those circumstances. The question is, why? Why, even after the American public has voted out several Congresses in a row, changed parties several times, unlike any other time in history, in recent history, why is it that politicians aren't responding by going back and earning our faith as Americans?
But I'd point out that we're doing something here which represents, I think, a cop-out, which is we're asked to discuss values and find what common ground we can have. And we all fall to explaining how much our government and our politicians fail us. Maybe a fair argument, and we ought to talk about the problems of implementing it, but shouldn't we be able to agree amongst ourselves first about those values and where we want to go? So, for example, I suggested 2 values, building the future and keeping together as one society. If you look, for example, at the tax code and take that as a concrete instance, I would think we could figure out ways in which we could make the tax code much more productive for our future, and also, and this would, I think, be contrary to many accepted propositions at the moment, tax both the wealthy and the rest of society that doesn't pay taxes, 50% of the society that's not paying taxes, enough so that taxation represented something that everybody in society assumed a fair share of. And my only point about that is, that's a discussion about the tax code, not in terms of raising revenue and reducing deficit, subject to observations about, well, you'd only gain 2%. That's a statement about society, akin to your statement as a university president. What are we doing? How do we build a society? And that's a different question, and we ought not to push it aside to politicians.
And it's also a question, I think, that, and let me bring in Jack on this, that says that we have to at least spend a portion of our mind and our resources more on the future than on the present, being willing to cut back in the present for the sake of the future.
And George, I'd like to just connect a couple of points, and building from Richard's very helpful comment regarding the importance of that value of our belief in the future. We were given a gift, our generation, and that was a gift of opportunity that came from our parents and our grandparents. But that gift did not come without sacrifice. Every one of us know that our parents and our grandparents sacrificed to enable us to have the kinds of opportunities that we did in our lives. And the question for us right now, are we engaged in the level of sacrifice necessary to provide for our young people?
I think that's right, but I want to bring in Calvin Butts here, because I could also imagine, and not only imagine, I know that you go to any number of middle-class households across the country and they say, who are you kidding? We're sacrificing every single day, especially in this economy right now.
No, we're not sacrificing. No, not going to every middle-class household, but just traveling the world and then coming back home and looking at what we have. Now, we give up a lot, but we can give up, some of us can give up a lot more. And I want to focus on something. I believe in the country. And I think the dialogue and the debate back and forth, if we have to throw out Congress after Congress after Congress, is what we're going to have to do until we get it right. Because we can't, what else are we going to do? There's no place better. And you've got young men and women who have no jobs, who are going off to die, literally, to protect this mess that we have. So we can't give up. Now I'm myself now.
Yeah.
But I'm back with my wife on this. I see the pickets, I see the demonstrations. We may not have a focus, but what one fundamental value is the hope that this nation gives, the opportunity to all. And there are things that we can sacrifice. Now, the least of us have not much to sacrifice. A person like myself and some others, we could be taxed more, we can give more, we live very well, and the thought of that for many of us is anathema. We don't want to do it, but we have to if we're going to survive.
Let me build on that and take it in a slightly different direction, because Peter, I think you've written about this, and forgive me if I put words in your mouth and correct me where I'm wrong, but what if that providing that opportunity for everyone can only be attained, we can only do big things if we have a little less democracy? If you basically give politicians the space, give commissions the space to go do their work, and say that we're not going to put it up for a vote. Like we're not going to allow the process to grind it down. We're going to try to find a way to push it through because we believe it's the right thing. Now, I know
reframe that slightly. I think one of the core problems here is that we are increasingly not one nation, that if you look at the evidence, we are effectively two nations united by a single Congress. We are physically and virtually separating ourselves into two opposing camps to a dramatic degree. Literally to the point of, at the neighborhood level, neighborhoods becoming increasingly Republican or increasingly Democratic. And then you add the technological change in the media, and we get a news feed. You're effectively having different realities.
And you combine that with redistricting and computerized creation of districts, and people become...
That makes it even worse. And all of the social psychology literature shows that if you put like-minded people together in a group, the group becomes much more extreme than any individual. And I think I don't actually think that it's just our political system failing the population. I think we are getting the political system that reflects that growing divide, and that the middle is an increasingly thin place to be.
Peter, I think you're absolutely right. The only thing is, I think you're descriptively right. And the question is, prescriptively, can we do anything about it? So a university or a school system or a tax system can work either to reinforce that or it can work against that. And I think we ought to be working to change that. I think, George, it's an illusion to think that government can do this divorced from the people. We have to bring the people with us. You can imagine a government solving some portions of our deficit problem without the people. You may be right, you may be wrong, but you can't imagine solving this problem without the people.
Yeah, because they have to feel very much that they've also participated. And, we have to trust ourselves. That's, I think, critically important. I do think you asked, why is faith in government reduced? And I think faith in a lot of institutions are reduced. Faith, for instance, in the Catholic Church, to name something I'm familiar with, is reduced, and faith in other institutions.
Faith in corporate America is way down.
Faith in corporate America, faith in all. So there is this, what you could argue is this, we've been told for the last many, many years, you are important by yourself. Make it on your own. Do it alone. And so we've been taught over and over again, you're supposed to stand on your own 2 feet. The idea of working in an institution is almost antithetical to a whole notion of this fierce individualism. So part of what has to change is a belief that we actually do need our children, our parents, our friends, our church, our all those institutions that help glue us to one another.
On this.
I just would note that the one institution in American life that most strongly fights that individualism is the military.
Absolutely.
Where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, the sense of team, of mutual commitment.
And the military and the judiciary probably are held in higher esteem than corporations, the press, Congress, or the White House.
I think we do have to take seriously, as your question implies, that populism is not always the friend of compromise. And as politicians do sometimes have to do their work. We're doing that now with the super committee, where it was very hard to get agreement more broadly in the Congress. I don't think it would be productive to take the Occupy Wall Street people and the Tea Party people and put them in the same room and ask them to have a discussion. That wouldn't address the problem. You, in fact, need people that take their representative role seriously, that know the process, to be able to have room to make exactly the kind of agreement you're talking about, tax reform that's going to raise revenues in a way that's acceptable to Republicans, and entitlement reform that doesn't make sure that entitlement spending doesn't crowd out all other spending in the budget over the next few decades. And this, that's the kind of agreement you need, but I'm just not sure populism gets us there.
Janet, go ahead.
One of the things that we started talking about was what's the philosophy by which we do our work? It's one thing to set out what is the work to do, but the other thing is under what rules are we going to govern? And trust is one of those, and civility is another one that Luis was mentioning. And maybe the conversation that we should begin talking about is what are the rules of interaction and philosophy that we're going to have, the rules of engagement. And then if we can agree that we're going to come out with a trustworthy solution, we're going to come out with one that is more productive. We're going to come out with one.
I think there's a tension there. I think I think everyone would agree on that. If you take the definition of civility to mean we should be polite, we shouldn't call each other names, we shouldn't attack our adversaries personally. But it gets a little more difficult if civility is taken more broadly to mean compromise more generally, compromise for the sake of compromise and getting along. And that runs right up against, I think, a lot of distrust people have of government. You saw that. I think one of the things you've seen in the last couple of years is new members of Congress get elected who want to maintain their integrity, and their own personal integrity and their own beliefs are more important than being civil in the sense of compromising for the sake of a greater good.
Civility is interesting, a notion, but not unless it takes us somewhere. But civility toward the notion of a common good would be a different kind of discussion. And so the rules of engagement, but toward a goal that you said earlier, set the goals that are very tough for us to meet, but at least set some rules of engagement by which we can all agree without killing each other in the process. We've got to come up with the solutions. In order to maintain integrity, in order to regain the faith that people have in us, we've got to come up with some final product.
But you also have to show that you're trying to get something done.
Exactly.
I mean, I have a set of principles and, want to maintain them, but in the process of trying to get some things done, you have to make some compromises. I'm not talking about compromises of principle, but there's going to be a little bit here and a little bit there. Let's move that ball a little further down the field. We have some folks in the Congress, I'm just going to say it, that the principle of whatever it is that they're trying to maintain appears to be more important than ever actually getting anything done. That's a lack of responsibility, in my opinion at least.
Is it that or is it integrity? I guess that's the question I'm asking.
Toward what end?
I would say a couple things. First, I do think that a solution to these problems will require people of all political stripes and in a variety of offices to decide that the challenge is important enough, that it is incumbent upon them first to govern, and then, only then, to be worried about getting reelected. And there are plenty of people worried about getting reelected, not a lot of people, in my opinion, who are worried about governing. But you asked an important question earlier, which is, are we willing to give up some of our democracy? I actually think, just as a mental exercise, it's worth thinking about, actually, maybe we need more democracy. Maybe what we need, just as an example, is the big idea that 36 senators stood together and said they were willing to sign up for, 13 and 13. The big idea, through the miracle of technology, put up to a virtual vote by the American people. What do you think about this? I have great faith in most people. If presented with a balanced solution, say, okay, maybe I can live with it. I think public servants might be very informed by how that agreement is responded to by folks.
Go ahead.
I think Carly makes a good point. And let me just bring it home, because the reality is that on the big three issues, taxation, defense, and putting Social Security on a more sustainable footing so that it's more secure into the future, the majority of Americans, 70%, on taxing the affluent, a clear majority on reducing the defense budget, and a clear majority on putting Social Security on a sustainable basis, agree those changes are needed. And that gets to Peter's point, a fundamental change on that 9%. And so I think this is a case where lots of fire comes from 99%ers and Tea Partiers, but the great majority of Americans on all three of the core issues agree that something has to be done.
And one of the reasons I think they do, by the way, we're back to values and principles. I actually think one of the values that American people hold is, you know what? What the current generation owes the future generation is not a guarantee. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to make a better life for yourself than we had for ourselves. It's not I think people hold that value dear.
I think people hold it at that level of abstraction. I think you're right. And Luis, I think you're exactly right when you say if you pose the question in the way you just posed it, saying putting Social Security on a sustainable path. Yeah, everybody's for that. This morning's Washington Post, reducing Social Security benefits, 83% oppose. So, but the question I want to pose to Carly, because I think you were getting at something important as well, because who knows what it would look like if you actually put it up for a rifle shot vote, let people decide. Do you think your colleagues would accept it even if they were opposed to it? Like, for example, 70% of the public would say raising taxes on the wealthy. There's a strong majority in the Congress against it.
First of all, I think what you would have to put up for a vote is a package solution. I think when you ask people an issue at a time, you exacerbate the conflict.
You speak just particular interests.
Yeah. So if you put a package together that said, all right, this set of things will solve the problem, and you put that up for a vote, and the majority of people who responded said, yes, we can live with that, then sure. There are going to be extremes on both sides who say, I don't like it, I'm not voting for it. But my own view is you would have enough people who say, we're representatives in this democracy.
Peter's been waiting to get on this, and then Kathleen.
I mean, I thought, in fact, that President Obama, I know you're no longer president.
Easy come, easy go.
President Obama and John Boehner had this idea that they did have a proposal, and John Boehner didn't think he could get it through his own House, and therefore it collapsed. That was the very idea that they had come up with, a grand bargain, and he didn't think it could get through.
But they didn't what I'm talking about is taking whatever the bargain is that people agreed to and actually asking the American people what they think. Look, we've all been in situations where we come up with a great idea with a colleague, and then we go out to the rest of our colleagues. How does it work with your faculty? You go off in a back room, you come up with a great idea, you come out, hey, isn't this great? Guess what? Nobody says it's great because they weren't in the room. They weren't in the room. So you have to have enough people in the room to present it to the American people. I just think it'd be interesting to find out what the American people thought.
Back to Peter with an observation. You brought up the example of Steve Jobs. He's famous for not conducting focus groups and saying it's not the job of the consumer to know what they want or what they need. It's my job. And that's,
But he also was willing, as were great visionary and entrepreneurs, they're willing to take the risk on themselves.
Well, that's the point, and that's where it comes back.
I fail.
And if you lose, you lose. You were waiting to get
Just 2 quick points. One is I actually do think one way of phrasing this is we do need more democracy. And one approach is the direct vote. Another approach is if you win a national election in a parliamentary system, you can actually go do your agenda. One of the challenges we have here is that in the system that we've devised, which is a different form of democracy, you win a national election, that doesn't mean you can go do anything.
That's because our founding fathers actually didn't want the federal government to do that much.
If they had had a few more women, we could have worked it out.
But hasn't recent experience, I want you to go on, but hasn't recent experience challenged that? I mean, you basically saw President Bush come in and push through the major elements of his agenda. President Obama came through, pushed through both his big piece of his economic agenda, plus healthcare reform, narrow majorities, but they got it through. But then it appears that these debates are never done in Washington.
Well, I think, look, and one way we solve these things is with a clean sweep of the House, Senate, and the Senate at a sufficient majority. Yes, you can go do things. The question is whether that threshold is now too high given the polarization that's happened. The other point, though, that I wanted to come back to is you asked about faith in government, which I think is just crucial. If you look at the two institutions you highlighted as still retaining more respect,
Military
and they're both relatively opaque institutions. And I think one of the things we just have to adjust to is, the saying, no man or woman is a hero to his valet or her valet. The fact of the matter is we're now effectively everybody's valet. And I don't think a lot of the leaders the great leaders that we elected in the past would get elected today in the kind of blogosphere, media, what have you. Much more information comes out, which of course denigrates or sort of depreciates the leadership aspect. And so I think we're not going to change that.
It gets to a really important point. You're saying, or you're positing, that transparency and openness on its own isn't a value. You wouldn't put much value in that.
No, I think, look, there are trade-offs.
It's more
and I think if we're going to have that, if we're going to have that transparency, I think we need to adjust the way we look at things. I think the generation that's in college today that's growing up with Facebook and social media and has the embarrassing photos from the parties that are going to last forever online, they're going to view those types of things differently than perhaps the generation that's up here. And I think we need to adjust similarly for our leaders. We can't expect to have full insight into everybody's lives and expect those people to be perfect. They are human beings. The public didn't hear about that before, and I think it leads to reduced respect.
But you're talking about individuals, but I think
leaders.
you're also, if you have full insight, full transparency of the process, by definition, I mean, we all know it's the famous, you don't want to watch legislation being made.
You don't have to know how I make a decision every time. You need to know what the rules are going to be about the way I make decisions. Right. So I don't convene the faculty on a university campus every time I make a decision, or I'd never move forward. But I have said with them, here's how we're going to hire faculty. Here are the things I'm always going to consider. Here's your role, here's my role. And if we agree on a process that we've both been at the table to devise, then there is then a level of trust after we've had a few encounters together. And I think what's happened right now is that we have no level of trust in our government, on regardless of what side of political party we are. And that's the real fear that I frankly have, because as I said earlier, we're training, we're educating, we're asking students to vest themselves in our democracy. We've got to earn that. When we give out diplomas, we say, this diploma is yours with all its privileges and its responsibilities. And so the question for us is, have we been responsible during our turn at bat?
I think that's a really good point, because I think what has happened when I've been at universities, again, goes to your question of government. Are we saying politics is an honorable profession, which is what I grew up with and still believe deeply that it is a fabulous way to make a difference and make an impact. But we've had politicians running against politics and running against Washington for a long period of time. And my work on community service has been the students would love to do service. Service is good. Service is holy. Service is honorable. But if you say that service is actually getting involved in politics, it somehow becomes dirty. And I think there is a big role for universities to help teach about the value of politics.
Politics has become a much more sordid affair. It is hard for me to understand how there has been, it seems to me, considerable compromise. I'm talking about this administration, this president, this budget. A willingness to go to the American people, a willingness to meet halfway, a willingness to talk about deep cuts and entitlements that we think we should be deserving of, a willingness to do everything, but yet a fundamental pushback where in my lifetime I believe that any other president, given a divided chamber, would have made much more significant progress. And I am deeply concerned about the fact that Mitch McConnell would say, we don't give a flip about all of this. We want to get Obama out of the White House. Now that presents for me a huge problem. And that's where race gets into this thing in terms of this budget discussion and the fundamental values of this nation, which initially were hypocritical in the first place.
But
So-
how is race implicated? I'm not following.
Because I simply believe that any other president, if he were white male, would have reasonably come to some compromise on this budget and been able to move this economy forward at this point.
I don't know.
That's my fundamental belief on this.
I'll challenge it with one memory of, the day after Bill Clinton got elected in 1992, Bob Dole said, "You're not getting one vote."
Not getting
on
one
our
vote.
side.
But Bill Clinton came out of this as being one of the most successful presidents in the history of the United States on budgetary concerns. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case for Obama. And I am concerned that while they did move against Clinton, it was never in the face of this kind of crisis in the nation economically. It gets quiet. And it to me is just unconscionable. And it gets to a fundamental issue of values in this nation, and it goes all the way back to the beginning. All the way back. And I think that we've got to face up to it, because this president, I'm upset with him a lot because I think that he could be bolder, but he's trying to say, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, we've got to try to meet halfway. And then when he gets there, and Boehner is with him, McConnell says, I don't care what you do, we got to get him out. That makes me freeze and wonder, are we really concerned about America?
Well, Kay, I wonder if we can actually come up with a definition of what common ground means that isn't so hopelessly. The only way we can agree on it is if it's hopelessly abstract.
Well, I thought that the idea that you said about what we care about is our future. Let's all say we want our children's future, we want Michael's future to be better than ours. Could we all agree to that? And part of Michael's future is obviously that he has jobs and job opportunities and the ability to create a life for himself, for his family. And I think that he doesn't have to spend every day worrying about his mother. And that means, because if he has to spend every day worrying about his mother, and she's going to move in with him because she's so sick, he's not going to be able to spend, because you wouldn't throw me out, right, Michael?
No, never.
No, but so that's a good question. If that's the question, then you want some way that I'm going to not be a burden to dear Michael.
George.
I think that the thing we've talked a lot about is a basic American value. And I think if our leaders elevated the dialogue and began to talk about the need for shared sacrifice for the benefit of our country's future, and then laid out the portfolio of things that everyone has to give up in order to ensure that future so that our children can have the kind of future we've been talking about.
Can I talk about sacrifice? Can I just say something about sacrifice? Sacrifice is a word that I think made a whole lot of sense after World War II, when people had really sacrificed. People died. My uncle died in World War II. So if my father or my uncle, John Kennedy, my father, Robert Kennedy, could talk about sacrifice, it was to an audience that had sacrificed, that understood it. We have not, over the last 40 years, asked our country to sacrifice.
We have thousands of children right now, thousands of children, old enough to be our children, who are in Iraq and Afghanistan, sacrificing every morning.
Absolutely, but it is not like World War II, where it was every family.
That's right.
In which case,
may be part of the problem.
So the word sacrifice, I think, is a much more difficult word today than it was 40 years ago. And I remember what my grandfather said when he was paying the 90% taxes. He didn't talk about sacrifice. He said, of course, this will make our country better. I'm interested in...
I think that link is part of the difficulty. I think people don't believe necessarily that their taxes are going to be spent in a way that makes sense to them and will make our country better. You've been patient.
Yeah, I know it's quite possibly one of the most uncomfortable topics, but if we can't with this kind of group, have some level of conversation about it, then you wonder why some other things don't get talked about in this country. So, I mean, Reverend Butts laid out a thought, a concern, an idea that is on the minds of a whole lot of people these days. And it became blatantly evident during the summer. We know the stats, you know them better than I do, the number of times that Ronald Reagan raised the debt ceiling, the number of times that Bush 1, Bush 2, President Clinton, et cetera, et cetera. But all of a sudden, we spent most of the entire summer first telling people what the debt ceiling was, because most people didn't know what it was or care. And all of a sudden, this is a major issue for the United States of America and the countries around the world trying to figure out what in the world we're doing for something that had been done 30, 40 some odd times over the past few years. But somehow, some way, under one particular president, it is now a global crisis. I think that we can't just kind of have that hang out there, act like it wasn't said, and move on.
Let me agree with that and broaden it if I can. I think the first principle is, as we're saying, the future and building for an America of the future. But a second principle has to be very much a part of it, and that is that we're all in this together. And that means we have to address the race issues. We also, in my view, have to address the issues of not stigmatizing the wealthy because they're wealthy, even while, in my view, they ought to be contributing more. And it's why I also suggest that in the tax code context, we also have to deal with a large fraction of people who aren't a part of it, who aren't themselves participants in the taxation system. But I would suggest there's another strand here that puts me perhaps in a different place from the other 9 of you and resistant to your proposition, George, in a different way. And that is, we all start with these propositions about government, its limitations, the lack of faith in it, et cetera. And then when we come to talk about solutions, we all say the government should do it. We ought to find our political leaders. They should come up with the big idea and announce it, et cetera. Since we all think that much of the vitality of America, perhaps most of the vitality of America, lies in the private sector, why do we punt these problems to those leaders? Isn't it really incumbent on us, both the 10 of us, but then a broader American public, to propose these big ideas and lead the political actors to that? These political actors don't have the time or the incentive or the ability to build that broader pattern. And that, it seems to me, is what these conversations ought to be about.
I think it's worth just providing a little context here on the budget debates we've been having over the last months and years. I think some of the reaction to the debt ceiling and other things took place because of the largest deficits in American history. For 3 years, over $1 trillion each year in deficits. And because that helped provoke a grassroots political movement that changed the nature of the Congress, that created resistance to the president's policies. Every president gets the ability to do some big things when they come into office, and this president had both houses of Congress. He used it to create a new entitlement, funded in part from money from Medicare, and to pursue a Keynesian stimulus package that many people resented. Okay? Now, rightly or wrongly, whatever its effect. That's the political context here. Also, the broader context of what we were talking about earlier is when we're talking about future deficits, almost all those deficits relate not to the fact that we're spending on education or foreign aid or all these other things. They exist because we have entitlement commitments, an aging population, and healthcare inflation. We have to have honesty. We talked about truth in this discussion. That's the problem that we face as a country. It's not adequate under those circumstances just to say, let's have an ever-increasing tax burden to fund unreformed entitlements that transfer huge amounts of money from the young to the old in America. That's not future thinking. That's not forward thinking. That, I think, is trying to maintain unsustainable entitlement commitments at the expense of young people in this country, instead of investing in things like education and social mobility, helping people get the skills in this economy to succeed.
I don't think it's a lack of good ideas. We had 3 members of we have Republican, Democrat, it was Daschle and Baker and one other person come together with an idea about how to reform health in our country. It was 2 years ago, and they presented it as a bipartisan proposition. So the good idea was there, and it was a bipartisan proposition, and yet we still had stalemate, to your point.
We might still have stalemate
And
in
Senator
this group as well. We're
Senator
running to
Deschler
the end of our time. I just want to bring it.
I think Michael's point was a good point, that if really the major issue is health care, it might be helpful to have that focus for your next conversation.
It's one great suggestion. Let me give it over to the president of Georgetown, President Ford, to wrap it up.
George, thank you very much, and to all of our panelists, thank you so much for your service this evening. You know, the greatest resource we bring to these challenges are the very values that are enshrined in this building, our National Constitution Center. And those values animated our conversation tonight, whether it be a commitment to the common good or respect for future generations, whether a commitment to opportunity, to equality. We can never forget that those values are often in tension with one another. We saw some of that in our conversation tonight. And the challenge, I think, for us is to try to ensure we bring those values together in a creative tension and bring out the very best that we're capable of.
You know, George, since the beginning, since this country was founded right here, we've held basic values about generational sacrifice, about shared sacrifice. And now, in a time of real crisis, we've got to bring ourselves back to that dialogue. And the only way it's going to happen is if the public does it. The only way it's going to happen is if the middle American steps up and makes his or her voice heard. My hope is that this conversation is the beginning of that the audience, that all the folks who see this material in other ways, on other venues, online and elsewhere, begin to demand a middle conversation, demand something that's an American conversation around leaving the country better for our children.
I'm sure it's going to spark a lot of conversations. I have no doubt about that, and it's because of your great contributions. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you for watching. No. Thank you. Good start.